The grandfather clock in the grand Lancaster estate struck 11, its deep chimes echoing through the vast hallways. Elena Carter gently closed the leather-bound storybook, careful not to disturb Sophie, the 5-year-old battling sleep with all the determination a child could muster. "Just one more story, Miss Elena," Sophie pleaded, clutching her favorite teddy bear, blue eyes shimmering with hope, her golden curls spilled messily across the silk pillowcase of the king-size bed. Elena shook her head, brushing a gentle hand through the little girl's soft locks. "It's way past your bedtime, sweetheart. Let me take you back to your room." Sophie's bottom lip quivered. "But I want to wait for Daddy. He promised he'd try to come home early tonight." The words struck a chord deep in Elena's chest. William Lancaster, CEO of Lancaster Industries, was a man of many things: powerful, brilliant, devastatingly handsome, but early had never been in his vocabulary. In the 6 months she had worked as Sophie's nanny, Elena had watched hope fade from the little girl's eyes, night after night. "Your father has important meetings, remember?" Elena kept her voice gentle, though frustration simmered beneath the surface. Sophie deserved more than empty promises. Sophie lowered her gaze, her voice a mere whisper. "He always has meetings. I just want him to kiss me goodnight, like he used to." Elena's chest tightened. Sophie rarely spoke of her mother, Clara, the woman who had abandoned her 3 years ago, leaving William to raise their daughter alone. After a moment of hesitation, Elena sighed. "All right, we can wait a little longer, but only until you fall asleep." Sophie's face lit up, and she snuggled deeper into the covers. Elena knew this was a mistake. She was crossing a forbidden line, stepping into William Lancaster's private world. The master bedroom was grand, yet unexpectedly intimate. Dark wood furniture, Egyptian cotton sheets in deep navy, and the lingering scent of his cologne made her pulse quicken. She told herself she would leave as soon as Sophie was asleep. But the bed was impossibly comfortable. The rhythmic sound of Sophie's breathing was hypnotic. Just for a moment, just until Sophie drifted off completely. And then Elena too surrendered to sleep, completely unaware that William Lancaster was on his way home. The bedroom door creaked open, spilling a sliver of hallway light into the dimly lit room. William Lancaster stood at the threshold, his sharp blue eyes scanning the scene before him. And then, he stilled. On his king-size bed, his daughter Sophie lay curled under the covers, her delicate features more peaceful than he had seen in months. But his attention was drawn to the woman beside her, Elena Carter. His daughter's nanny was fast asleep, her breathing steady, one arm trapped in Sophie's tiny grasp as if the little girl refused to let go. William's brows furrowed. What was she doing in his room? He was a man who valued his privacy. His bedroom was off-limits to everyone, and yet here she was. A flicker of displeasure passed through him, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Sophie was sleeping soundly. No tossing, no restless whimpers, no tear-streaked cheeks. William lingered for a long moment, watching them, seeing Sophie so at peace, so content in Elena's presence. Something heavy and unspoken settled in his chest. It wasn't just relief, it was longing, a longing he hadn't even realized he carried. But instead of confronting it, he pushed it aside. His steps were near soundless as he crossed the room. Elena stirred slightly, sensing his presence. Her amber eyes fluttered open. For a brief second, she gazed at him in sleepy confusion, then jerked upright, realization dawning on her. "Mr. Lancaster?" she gasped, immediately sitting up without waking Sophie. I can explain." William lifted a hand, silencing her. His gaze didn't leave his daughter. There was a softness in Sophie's expression, a peace that had been missing for too long. He sat on the edge of the bed, loosening his tie with a quiet sigh. "Does she do this often?" Elena hesitated, then nodded. "Every night." Something flickered in William's eyes, something dangerously close to regret. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by his usual unreadable mask. At last, he turned to her, voice low but firm. "Stay." Elena blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Excuse me?" William leaned back in his seat, still watching Sophie. If she wakes up and you're not here, she'll cry." His words were neither an order nor a plea, just a fact. Elena hesitated. She had never seen William Lancaster like this, exhausted, contemplative, and just a little lonely. She could refuse. She should refuse. But looking down at Sophie, still clinging tightly to her, Elena knew she couldn't walk away. "All right," she whispered, "I'll stay." William didn't respond, merely giving a slight nod. But just as he shifted in his seat, Elena heard him murmur under his breath. So soft it was barely more than a thought. "I never realized what I was missing." When Elena woke the next morning, the first thing she noticed was that William Lancaster was gone. Only Sophie remained, still curled up beside her, golden curls a tangled mess against the silk pillow. But on the nightstand, a small note with bold, precise handwriting made Elena's breath catch. "Early meeting. Sophie was still asleep. I moved her to her room before I left. We need to talk. My office, 7 p.m. WL." Elena clutched the note, her pulse quickening. She couldn't stop thinking about the strange silence between her and William last night. About the way he had looked at Sophie, with something unspoken in his gaze. The day passed in its usual rhythm, preparing Sophie's breakfast, overseeing her lessons, accompanying her in the sprawling Lancaster estate gardens. But there was a shift that Elena couldn't ignore. William was trying. He came home earlier than usual, making an appearance at dinner, a rare occurrence. And he didn't just nod at Sophie before retreating to his study. He actually listened. Elena watched from a distance, unable to deny the warmth that spread through her chest as Sophie beamed up at her father. But what unsettled her most was the way William looked at her. That evening, at exactly 7 p.m., Elena stepped into William's office. He wasn't behind his desk as she had expected. Instead, he stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading sunset. "Mr. Lancaster, about last night." He turned, piercing blue eyes meeting hers. "Elena, drop the formalities." She blinked. "What do you mean?" William took a measured step forward, his voice low but certain. "Sophie adores you, and I trust you more than anyone else. There's no need for unnecessary distance between us." Elena opened her mouth to protest, but something in his expression, so unwavering, so sincere, made her hesitate. She swallowed. "All right." "William." A flicker of a smile crossed his face, so brief yet it made her heart skip a beat. She had crossed the first boundary, and she knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The whispers started the next morning. Elena noticed it immediately. The stolen glances from the staff, the hushed conversations that died the moment she entered the room. Even Mrs. Reynolds, the Lancaster housekeeper, regarded her with a sharper gaze than usual. Elena tried to ignore it, but as she passed through the kitchen, she caught two maids gossiping about her. Who does she think she is, from a nanny to the master's bed? Please, it's probably just a fling. Men like him don't take women like her seriously. Elena clenched her fists, her chest tightening with frustration. She had done nothing wrong, but that didn't stop the rumors from spreading. And soon, she understood exactly where they had started. Because that morning, a familiar name appeared in the society pages. Vanessa Sterling, William's ex-fiancée. The perfect, stunning, powerful woman who had once nearly become Mrs. Lancaster. And now, she was back in town. The article didn't mention Elena outright, but the implication was clear. Vanessa Sterling returns after years abroad. Could there be a second chance for love? A warning. Elena's stomach twisted. She knew William wasn't the type to let the past dictate his future, but she couldn't ignore one undeniable truth. Vanessa belonged in his world. And she did not. But before she could dwell on it any longer, an even bigger storm arrived. A woman appeared at the Lancaster estate gates, her eyes burning with anger and intent. Clara, Sophie's biological mother, the woman who had abandoned her daughter 3 years ago. And now she was back, with a clear purpose. She wanted Sophie back. News of Clara's return spread quickly. Elena was preparing Sophie's breakfast when Mrs. Reynolds appeared, her expression grim. "Miss Elena, there's something you need to see." A thick envelope lay on the table, the handwriting scrawled across it uneven. Elena opened it, and her stomach dropped. Inside were dozens of photographs, each one deliberately arranged. Her leaving homes late at night, hugging children goodbye, standing at the doorsteps of wealthy families. They were all families she had worked for, but to an outsider, they told a completely different story. A single note slipped onto the table. "Leave quietly, or these photos go straight to the Lancaster board. They won't believe you're innocent. V.S." Elena's grip tightened, her fingers trembling. Her pulse pounded in her ears. If these photos got out, the whispers wouldn't just be whispers anymore. They would be knives, cutting through her reputation, her life, and worst of all, Sophie's happiness. Vanessa. Of course it was her, but before she could think of what to do, William entered the kitchen. Sophie ran up to him instantly, wrapping her arms around his legs. "Daddy, Miss Elena made me pancakes." Then Elena forced herself to smile, to hide the fear gripping her chest. But William was already watching her closely. She couldn't let him know. She couldn't let Sophie know. And then Clara walked in, right into the grand Lancaster living room. She stood there, her red-brown hair disheveled, but her eyes blazing with determination. "I want my daughter back." The room fell deathly silent. Then, William spoke, his voice cold as steel. "You abandoned Sophie 3 years ago. You have no rights here." Clara smiled, a slow, victorious curve of her lips. "You think so? Let's see what the courts have to say." And then she dropped the final bomb. "Oh, and by the way, I think the Lancaster board will be interested in this. Sophie isn't your biological daughter. Sophie isn't William's biological daughter." Clara's words cut through the room like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. Elena turned to William. He didn't look surprised. There was no shock, no denial, only a deadly calm in his piercing blue eyes as he stared at Clara. He had known. Elena felt her heart constrict. Clara folded her arms, smirking. "You have no legal claim over her, William. She's not yours." "But she is mine." William was frighteningly composed. He stepped forward, his voice slow, deliberate. "Being a parent isn't about biology, it's about responsibility, and you abandoned yours a long time ago." Clara blinked but held her ground. "The law doesn't care about your emotions. I have every right to take her back." "No, you don't." William walked to his desk, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved a thick stack of documents. He tossed them onto the table, his gaze razor-sharp. "You never paid a cent in child support. You haven't contacted her in 3 years. You have a record of debt, evictions from at least 3 different apartments." He tilted his head, a cold smile playing at his lips. "You think a judge will hand her over to you?" Clara went pale, but William wasn't finished. He threw another file onto the desk. "And here's proof of your financial transactions with Vanessa Sterling. You took her money right before you came back into town." The room fell silent. William slowly crossed his arms, voice dripping with disdain. "You sold your daughter twice, Clara, and now you think you deserve her back?" Clara had no response. Her hands trembled, her face ghostly white. At last, she cast a furious glare at Elena, as if this was somehow her fault, before turning on her heel and storming out without another word. William watched her disappear, his shoulders finally relaxing as if a weight had been lifted. Elena stood frozen, her heart pounding. She swallowed. "You knew, didn't you?" William turned, his blue eyes locking onto hers, sharp but impossibly gentle. "I've known for a long time," he admitted, "but it never mattered." Elena forgot to breathe. William stepped closer, his gaze burning into her. "Family isn't about DNA, Elena. Family is about who stays, who fights, who loves unconditionally. And I chose Sophie from the moment I held her in my arms, and I will keep choosing her, no matter what." Elena couldn't look away, but before she could respond, a small voice came from the door. "Daddy?" Sophie stood there, wide blue eyes looking up at them, voice small. "Do I have to leave?" Elena felt her heart shatter, but William didn't hesitate for a second. He crouched down, opening his arms. "No, sweetheart, you are always staying, I promise." Sophie ran into his embrace, burying her face against his chest. "I love you, Daddy." William held her close, his gaze flickering up to Elena's. A silent promise. Everything had finally settled. A few days later, William's lawyers confirmed that Clara had officially withdrawn her custody case. With no chance of winning, she disappeared from the city without a trace. Vanessa Sterling had also lost. After evidence of her manipulating the scandal and bribing Clara was exposed, her reputation was utterly destroyed. But for Elena, the greatest victory wasn't in defeating Clara or Vanessa. It was in seeing Sophie laugh more, sleep soundly, and no longer fear being abandoned. One late afternoon, Elena stood in the Lancaster estate garden, watching Sophie play with William under the golden glow of the setting sun. The little girl ran towards them, eyes sparkling. "Daddy, Miss Elena, can I make a wish?" William knelt, pulling Sophie into his arms. "What do you wish for, Princess?" Sophie looked between them, then beamed. "I wish we could always be a family." William chuckled, his gaze soft as it rested on Elena. "Then you don't have to wish for it, Sophie, because that will always be true." He reached for Elena's hand, his grip firm and sure. "Family is a choice, and I choose you, Elena, forever." Elena squeezed his hand back, her heart overflowing. She had spent her life searching for a place to belong, never knowing it would find her instead. And now, as she looked at William and Sophie, their family, their home, their forever, she realized she had never been more certain of anything in her life.